The Liberating Arts seeks to articulate the enduring relevance of a liberal arts education during a time of pandemic and protest. Through our online platform, we will host a series of conversations with writers, academics, institutional leaders, and public intellectuals about the nature of the liberal arts, their formational purpose, and their moral significance in a time of great cultural disruption. We hope to inspire viewers and listeners to learn more about the liberating effects of these arts on their own lives. To find out more, please visit www.theliberatingarts.org or find us on Twitter, Facebook, Spotify, or YouTube.
Welcome to the Liberating Arts Definition Channel. I'm Rachel Griffiths, Assistant Professor of English and Director for the Integration of Faith and Learning at Sterling College in Central Kansas. I'm hosting a conversation with Shannon Ray, who has done a variety of significant work in different disciplines. He teaches leadership and forgiveness studies at Gonzaga University. He is also a licensed clinical psychologist, as well as a poet, novelist, and author of short stories. His creative writing has received numerous awards, which I'm not going to list, but I highly recommend his short story collection, American Masculine, which was mentioned in a list from Esquire magazine titled 3 Books Every Man Should Read. I just thought that was really interesting and that everybody needed to know that. Shan has also published scholarship on forgiveness and servant leadership. In addition to having many intellectual accomplishments, Shan is also a basketball player, and he played in college as well as in a professional league in Europe. I'm excited to talk with Shan today about psychology and the liberal arts. So Shan, I'm wondering if you can tell us about your own education. I know that you have an MFA and a PhD, but I don't know what your undergraduate studies is in. And then if you could talk a little bit about how you made your way into higher education.
Thanks for the question. Great to be with you, Rachel. So good to see you again.
It's really good to see you too.
So I think I was happily lost in high school. I didn't really know what I wanted. My dad and mom, I would say, trained my brother and I to get good grades. So that was of benefit, even if I was definitely very resistant to school. I didn't realize it back then, but I lived a much more of an intuitional or circular versus linear oriented life, Loved the wilderness. I would say from a distance, loved poetry, loved music up close. And so the walls of the school felt very confining. And literally, as a high school person, probably to me, I spent a lot of time thinking this is just totally inappropriate, And I thought things like, we could learn all this in an hour a day easily. Okay. And and you kind of see education go somewhat in that direction when you start seeing all these different variations. Like if we'd had those back then, where I could maybe go start some college classes or maybe do an apprenticeship in poetry somewhere, or It just wasn't really designed that way at that time. It was so. I think even though I got good grades, I just felt disappointed in the structure, the structural equation that was education in America at that time. And definitely got a lot of good things out of education. I loved a lot of my teachers deeply. However, I just thought the way it was set up. So I didn't understand that. I just was starting. So then when I went to college, I thought, well, I don't know, my brothers had, some giftedness and more of the linear math side of things. I'd taken all the math in our high school, and I thought maybe I'll go into computer science like him. And I went in, and that's when my persona, or maybe my ethos as an individual inside the collective of education in the world, really fought me, because I got in there and I'm like, wow, after about a year, I really could tell this isn't for me, And part of it was just, again, a certain linearity, a rationality. And I think I was thirsting for mystery and, again, more circular understandings. I think I was also thirsting for a non-dominant, non-patriarchal male educational culture. Okay. And the arts usually provides that. I didn't know that yet. because we just didn't have much exposure to the arts as a family just yet, with so much physicality and focus on wilderness. We're in the Montana wilderness a lot as a family. And that's probably where the love for the mystery came in. So I then moved from computer science, and I just wasn't sure, and part of that was I wasn't ready yet to say, yeah, this is worthy of my deepest investment, whatever it would be, And I think I was also pretty multivalent as a person, just enjoyed polyphonic life, So I kind of didn't want to be in one place, but that, and I was always, I would say, I wasn't the type that would throw away the fact that you're in college and you can get a degree, so even if I didn't really identify with the fields I was in yet, I knew I would get a degree, because that would just be part of whatever was coming next, and again, it was probably my mom and dad, their giftedness in valuing education. I think if I didn't have that from them, I might have just, slipped away, but it was so solid in them. And so I ended up in communications and then organizational communication. I was closer, definitely had an identification with people and how, to the ways of being in closeness, collective unity with people, I would say. But it was also still yet, I just didn't know enough about possible fields and what maybe I should go toward. And by the end of that undergrad, I was at Montana State University first. So large, well, not that large, but large-ish state school. And then went to my first liberal arts university at Pepperdine University for my last 3 years. And that way of doing education really spoke to me. And I think it was the blend of art, faith, and science that was profound, the way Pepperdine did that.
Okay.
And I didn't know that, well, there's lots of schools that's their way of looking at life and learning, So I felt like it was just an unfolding there. And some of those professors were just stellar. I mean, so good in so many different fields. So that was great. And then I had the opportunity, because of Pepperdine, they do certain things that are sort of quiet. And they asked me, I had a group of men that we had met together for about 2.5 of those 3 years. And we had a vision, kind of back to the polyphonic, and the vision was about faith and servanthood towards the marginalized in society. So we really built out groups on the campus that ended up really thriving and being highly attended. And then we built out time with the homeless in Santa Monica and in Los Angeles, outside the Midnight Mission, and all, there's about 15 of us, and everybody was completely devoted. And also just gracefully, as we graduated, it was one of those sort of fascinating things where, of that group, almost everybody ended up being the top student in their area. Ended up being, and the university has these two things, like what they call, they have Man of the Year and Woman of the Year, which is sort of like an all-around thing, and then they have like a Christian Service Award, and literally for like 5 semesters in a row, these guys all got all of those, So we didn't even know about those things. We're just living our lives, and then, but the university does some special things there. So at one point they pulled me aside my senior year and said, we really appreciate, your life and investment in us. We'd like to invest in you. We'd be willing to pay for a master's degree. I never thought about graduate work. I was, at that time playing basketball and going towards professional basketball, and maybe I would think of it later or something, but that kind of changed the trajectory. I did go play in Germany, and then that was my wife, Jennifer, in my first year of marriage. Great year together. Also huge learning. That year, I remember first time I encountered Black History Month was on the Army base in the town I was in Gießen, and the U.S. Army base there, the bookstore had like 5 or 6 huge rows devoted to Black History Month.
Wow. And
almost, one pretty large row was Martin Luther King Jr. So, all you have is time when you're playing professional basketball. I mean, you certainly worked thousands and thousands of hours to get there, but once you're there, it's practice 2 hours per evening, 8 to 10, couple games per week, 3 days off on the weekend, all day long, just off, because you're practicing that. So, so there was time, just lots of time. So I decided I would read all of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian, and all of Martin and all of Martin Luther King all in the same year.
Okay.
And I didn't know until later, really, the connection between Bonhoeffer and the Black church in America, So that's kind of fascinating that those two were, coming down into my life at that time.
Right.
And just a great pairing. I mean, their writings are such an incredible pairing of writers. And, that's stayed with me up until now, where just, these days I'm reading all of Bell Hooks and all of Cornel West, for example. And, that's really an echo of those two original writers too. And there's a lot of that. If I'm in fiction or poetry, similar. I love the deep dive. And if I'm in science too, I love the deep dive. And and I've always loved it being polyphonic again, So, but I didn't know how that worked really. I just thought, okay, I discovered after going through, deciding on a master's degree, what would I do? Well, it might be journalism or history or something on the streets. I really considered just serving the homeless and not doing any degrees and any further degrees or anything. Might be writing, but I quickly thought if it's writing, with my writing, we wouldn't be able to afford enough to eat a hamburger. So, I've sort of had a decent knowledge that from the books I had read that's a lifetime devotion. And it may not, in my case, be best to try to rely on that for staying alive as far as basic living. And so, and I could see other friends going for that and just the difficult road of like, whether you're a barista or whether you're got a job that is mind numbing. And so you can't write or, I kind of foresaw all that thankfully and thought, okay, I'm just going to, and I started to discover I love 10 and 20 year projects, which is strange, but part of my Czech Bohemian heritage probably mixed with German. And finally I started discovering that. So I decided, long road, let's do the long road. Finally fell in love with systems psychology, working with couples, marriages, families on generational trauma and wound patterns, and make, forming and shaping people into the transitional generation into healing patterns. And that just was like finding lightning and like you actually have a hand on the lightning all the time. So that was the first time I thought, oh, this is real. This is really education in the work of everyday life. I felt it in working with homeless. I felt it in the depth of Germany and reading Bonhoeffer and MLK. But then it was like coalesced, like, okay. So went through that all the way through Pepperdine master's degree and then PhD up in Canada, University of Alberta. Dissertation was on hermeneutic phenomenology. So in the interpretive understanding of life phenomenon, and what, that's basically getting at the essence or the lived experience, the lived world, the essence of something, a phenomenon. So the phenomenon that I studied was the forgiving touch. When you touch someone and you're trying to communicate forgiveness, or when you are touched and you feel you touch physically and you feel forgiven. And so I was always pretty, how do you call that? Like, outside of the norm. I never thought I need to go fulfill what this or that professor is doing on their research agenda. Like that was never a single thought of mine. It was always like, what would be fascinating? What do I want to be in? And that was it. And that was great. What a great journey. Then I worked at a rehabilitation hospital and had rotations in neuropsychology and in sort of behavioral and mental disorders and then in sort of bodily neurological functioning. And so the science and the art was kind of starting to come together, with the scientific understanding of people. And I was always reading things that, like, psychologists that wrote literary things, like Yalom's, Yalom's Love's Executioner. He's kind of one of the American names in existential psychology.
Okay.
And I was branching slowly over into, Andre Dubus the third, but before him was Andre Dubus,
Okay.
And I was reading that while I'm doing all this other work in science. And so it was starting to come together. Then I'm in Spokane finally. Jen and I are settling down there. And I'm working at a healing center, a Franciscan healing center. I wasn't raised Catholic myself. I always had deep admiration for the writers and thinkers and theologians of Catholicism, and just thought, what a unique mix, everybody from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin to, Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologica to, like the modern expressions of, liberation theology. And if we go to things like Black liberation theology, just had always had a love. So that eventually started aiming me working at this healing center, then getting hired at Gonzaga as a professor. That's a Jesuit university. So I went from a Franciscan healing center to a Jesuit university.
Okay.
I have always maintained my psychology practice along the way, and the forgiveness research. But in that early time, I wanted to go into, what I would say first love, which would be poetry. And so now it's okay. We could not only eat hamburgers, we could provide hamburgers for other people. And now I can go into this deep dive. And that actually was helpful because all these other dives, into science, social science, theology, forgiveness research, research in genocide, all these things were really at play when I came into the MFA. And then I had time, and I didn't think about it as I need another degree. And we ended up having, one of the great MFA programs, one of the oldest ones too, in America here in Spokane at Eastern Washington University. And, their magazine's Willow Springs, a great long-term, awesome magazine. Worked on the magazine, took the classes, and I literally in my head said, I'm just going to study this for 10 years. I'm just going to do an apprenticeship here.
10 years.
Yeah, and just not tell any of the professors that's what I'm doing.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that was probably a good choice.
Yeah, and so in any case, I did that. But at around year 6, my advisor's like, "Why are you still here?" So then I said, "Well, I just figured I'd study for 10 years. I'd take all the classes in poetry, and then I'd take all the classes in fiction. And he's like, "Well, you didn't want to graduate?" I'm like, "It's okay. I mean, I can, but I'm not too worried about that." I mean, he's like, "Well, according to us on the catalog, you got to be done next year." So I'm like, "Well, I have all the classes for fiction and all the classes for poetry. So do you think I could do a thesis this year in poetry and a thesis next year in fiction?" And he's like, "No."
Really? He said no.
Yes. And I think it's back to, the linear world, which we might call the patriarchal world, has a fight with the circular world, which we might call the feminine world, Okay. And of course, in science, holistic health is the balance of the feminine and the masculine in full healing, So when I'm hearing some type of linearized patriarchy, I'm not going, that sounds good. I'm trying to figure out how can we make that more circular, When I'm hearing some type of over circularized feminine, that often, in the research it shows that, the masculine resists or does not receive the influence of the feminine. The feminine resists or critiques the masculine, and that causes, all kinds of alienation, nationally and internationally. And the research is incredibly profound on all this. So when he says no, I don't go, "Okay, sounds good. You're my professor." I go, "Well, I'd like you to ask the whole faculty and tell me what they say." And that doesn't mean he's going to do that, but it doesn't mean I'm going to go, "Okay, you're not." If he said no, I'd say, "Well, I'm going to go ask him."
Okay.
So anyway, and so that's probably Montana background, probably basketball stuff where you've had hundreds of confrontations. So thankfully, I'm not very worried about confrontations. I have a decent understanding of how to make those go, shape them to not be alienating or fracturing, and psychology obviously very helpful there too. But anyway, then he asked the faculty and he got back to me saying, "Well, they said yes."
Wow.
So that's the journey, right? It ended with, the thesis in poetry, and then the next year the thesis in fiction. And so that was kind of a blessing because I literally just thought I would be taking classes, but then I ended up with this, beautiful little dual masters in poetry and fiction,
Yeah.
and so that was neat, and stayed in touch with my professors that I loved there over the years, and that's been great. But that was kind of the whole journey. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I love the way that the different disciplines have worked together and have kind of pushed you in different directions, and how different kinds of reading traditions that you've drawn upon to get where you are. That's definitely the kinds of things that we are talking about in these conversations about the liberal arts, is the connections between these different disciplines.
More important than we think, right? Like Pepperdine gave me that, and I'm forever grateful for that. I love those connections.
I was wondering if maybe I sent you a question about your professional life being very interdisciplinary.
Yes.
Could you tell us about the things that you're involved in, kind of on a maybe like weekly or monthly basis, so I know that you have your therapy practice, you write, you do creative writing, you do scholarship, you teach.
I never wanted like my studies or my writing to interrupt my family. So that's, some people would be like, well, geez, how are you going to do your studies? Well, I would, if I got to spend time with my family, when I was doing the PhD in Canada, I don't care if I study all night. If I partied with my wife and our friends, went out and had a great meal and had a great conversation and stayed up till 1, I'm ready to study the rest of the night,
Wow.
So, and that's like my personality,
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm like, oh, I'm studying and I'm not with my wife and friends, I don't want to study,
Okay.
So it's kind of, I started to know that about myself. So I don't mind. I'll catch up on sleep another time, or so my life's still pretty much organized that way. So I don't have anything that starts before 11, because writing time is after Jen goes to sleep. So writing time is between 10 and 1.
Okay.
Most nights. And if I'm on a project, that'll be literally most every night for however long that project is. Might be a year, 2 years, 3 years. Depending on the project, some are longer, but I'm not on a project. I'm just feeding that life, the life of art and circularity and, kind of communal life with the heart or soul of people, humanity, listening, being taught by them. So I might be watching interviews, I might be watching basketball, I might be, reading, but if it's a project, then I'm mostly writing, but that all spreads out over time. So that's how the output happened, is just, and that probably also came from basketball. I mean, if you're going to be a great shooter, you have to put in multiple hours per day. And you will never be a great shooter if you don't put in multiple hours per day for a long time, and so that would probably be, you probably need each person would need a good 5 to 7 years if you're going to have the highest percentages, as a shooter. Free throws, 3-point line, the rest, layups and mid-range and stuff. So I always understood, like, okay, I want to put in time as a writer. It was already developed in me. So yeah, that started probably a good 27 years ago,
Okay.
So just add up all those hours.
Yeah.
Lots of projects end up coming out, lots of failed ones, 4 novels that failed, before one was taken,
Okay. Yeah.
And 10, 12 years of rejections on stories and poems before the first acceptance. And still plenty of rejections. I mean, we all experience that, that's the great part about the arts, the world of the arts, is that it is vetted. It's not just everything goes or everything,
Right.
It's the same thing as anything else in life. Like, there's a reason why we really love the Olympics. Not everybody can do that. And the reason not everybody can do that is it takes 1 million hours to and so if we're admiring a Steinbeck or a Toni Morrison or any of the greats, Layli Long Soldier, there's been a lot of distilling, and so I always admired that. I always loved that part of art and athletics and science. So if we take the book Atomic Theory 7, Poems to My Wife and God, that one entered in and really came out in a flash of light, like, just like many projects. Some are like long, disciplined. You have to put in the time, and it's like pulling a thorn out of your heart or something. And there's a big gap.
But not those poems.
Yeah, there's a big gap when it's gone. Now those poems had a piece of that, but they had also like this drive, what is it about us that wants to blame God for genocide, or God for trauma, or blame God for loss, or blame God for grief? When, in my opinion, we should be blaming ourselves, And not only that it's not God, but God is intimately with us in all of those traumas, in my opinion. And that kind of came out of Rilke's Book of Hours. So Rilke's a beautiful writer. I want to say also he experienced a lot of abandonment as a young person. And then he also abandoned his own daughter,
Okay.
And part of that was kind of the European art scene at that time. But he writes in the Book of Hours this gorgeous God who's also extremely distant, So it's like a Northern European understanding rather than a Latin understanding or Latin American understanding of closeness and blood and flesh, Europe is, we just take those two cultures. One is much more dry and cloaked. I mean, you got to wear more coats. It's colder, And some, that Germany and Czechoslovakia, you have different nuances too, But if we take that compared to Mexico, where I am right now, blessing of Mexico, even the crosses, like the crosses here are full of color, and also full of blood, and also full of death masks, And the crosses in Northern Europe are almost always like metal and wood and very straight, and nothing on them a lot of times, or a very stark body of Christ, not necessarily a friendly or loving body of Christ, or a bloody body of Christ, So all these understandings are starting to come together. Like, what about not a distant God that we sort of have to wander through genocide, and because that distant God, how could you make pain happen? How about a God that gave us free will, and therefore pain has to happen? It's not God wanted you to have pain, in my opinion. It's a deeply intimate, I'm here with you. If we're going to have free will, there is always going to be choices. If we're going to have choices, there's always the choice of evil or good. And there's also the massive blend of what's evil and what's good, and shadings, and a huge continuum and circularity that no one can fully understand. So that's where that book just, and I kind of thought, like, man, these poems will have no chance, because I basically did research on one-to-one violence, tons of research on just intimate, person-to-person, knifings, bullet wounds, machetes, torque and tension harm on the body, and that was gruesome and terrible, that research. And then I did research on atomic theory, subatomic particles, all the way smallest subatomic particles, all the way up to the massive expanse of the atomic universe, and light, and that light is the binding principle inside everyone's DNA and inside the universe. And then you've got faith, all faiths speaking of light on some level, and if we take Christianity, which I have a devotion to, this notion of Christ, probably from Teilhard de Chardin, a cosmic Christ as a milieu that we might call love, the idea that God is love, and that absorbs and embodies all science, all art, all relationships, all fracture, all unison. And of course, we see that in the atomic structures of the universe. Fission is fracture, and it is powerful, but it's also not even close to as powerful as fusion, which is reunification. So in a sense, we could say that's a theology of fusion, with fission accepted or absorbed inside it. Fracture is absorbed inside it. So you can see why I got so thrilled about this.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, well, this is just crazy. It's like it can be too abstracted. So all the poems are always like being grounded in everything from milfoil to the beak of the blackbirds of Montana, all the different 50 variations of blackbirds, and you're always grounding it, in the hand of the beloved, or the lifeline of the child and placing a kiss on the inner wrist, because there can be so much abstraction. But in any case, then that one somehow united because Vietnamese American painter Trinh Mai, my poems and her paintings appeared together in Ruminate magazine. So I just called her up while I'm in this big project. I hadn't thought about it, but poet friends were like, whoa, these are heavy. And I knew that too. It's a different book. Like, you read it more like a contemplation. They were like, what can you do between these 7 sections? Can you put like the line drawings or something? And eventually I came upon, oh wow, what if Trinh was interested in her paintings? Her paintings were in between it, So now it's even more crazy. Like, who's going to publish that? Because you've seen some of my temperament, and I'm not going to be like having a publisher say, well, we could do it in black and white.
Right. Yeah.
That's going to break the deal for me. So, and it has to be at the level that Trinh, my artist, loves how it appears, But the poems, thankfully, they were taken very fast, almost immediately, in huge sections.
Wow.
Six different places took at least 11 poems.
Okay.
And so that was strange, and I didn't know that was even existed, because you're used to sending out 3 to 5 poems, and this time I just said, well, here's the whole section of 11. I mean, if you might be interested in 1 or 2, but these places would be like, no, we'd like all 11, And I don't know what that's about. That's probably something about the mystic again. But in any case, it's probably also about hunger for existential love and closeness, too, I would say. So in any case, then we get to the publishers, and that too was totally different. Usually everything's like rejected for a long time, and then you're like, somehow something comes together. But this one, like, it was a finalist in this one, but before Marsh Hawk Press, before that got announced on who the winner would be there, because they do art and poems, and this other place took it, so I was like, wow, okay. And while I'm in negotiations there, I'm saying what I just told you, like, can you guys do full color? Can you do hardback and paperback? And they're like, yeah, of course, we'd love to. And I'm like, can you do color that my painter, Trinh Mai, is the one that gets the okay on, not just you all, but she gets to okay it. Yeah, we'd love it. So
that's amazing.
And it's incredible. Like, when I look at the book now, every time you're like, wow, they did a great job. It's like the colors are perfect. They look exactly like what her paintings look like, And so, yeah, that was a beautiful collaboration, and all part of that unity between the masculine and the feminine again, and her history, Vietnam and America's history, just bring that book alive, because her history is, her family coming from Vietnam and many people dying, and them being able to come to America, and it preserves their faith in many ways. And they, of course, preserve, love for America, even though we, did very difficult things. Especially in pulling out. When we did, we basically left hundreds of thousands of people to die, And so, that whole thing, the forgiveness piece in Trinh Mai's family. Yeah. Long story to say, the week is pretty laid out, though. I would say it's loose, but I'm very strategic about the sets of hours, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really great description of your multi-dimensional life. And then also, I like the example of this poetry collection, that also, all the different kind of research that you had to do. And then, of course, its presentation in terms of the poetry and the art being together. I think that's really, that's really amazing. So I'm going to bring us hopefully back to the discipline of psychology. But do you have a definition of the liberal arts, and if you could maybe articulate a little bit about how you see psychology contributing to that definition and vision of the liberal arts?
I mean, I like how you have a frame of liberation. That's probably, when I heard that from you, I thought that's probably my main definition. is that an understanding that comes from the liberal arts, in its essence, should be morally, existentially, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, social justice, liberating. It should create greater wholeness, greater peace in the terms of servant leadership, greater wisdom, greater autonomy, greater health, greater wisdom, greater freedom, and greater service of life itself, greater service, especially of anybody that's in the margins, that, what Cornel West claims often as the wretched of the earth, claiming all of us as part of the wretched of the earth, but that we would be devoted to the wholeness of life, that all people when we find ourselves as the wretched of the earth, would be offered kindness and friendship, and so that's how I see the liberal arts, and I think it just does such a great job of that, because it's not bifurcated, it is not binary. If you're going to study history and science and poetry and dance and music and chemistry and atomic theory and James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, you're going to have a much more holistic sense of the world. If you're only going to study computer science, or you're only going to study poetry, that's going to be highly limiting, in my opinion, comparatively. So, and I think we have a generation that really wants that more broad, more diversified, back to the term multivalent or polyphonic, life, that people are willing really to invest in that, and they're willing to receive that, sort of that unity, I guess, of what we might call the substructures or the superstructures of creation, or of our existence, or it just makes more sense in a lot of ways to say it'd be good to understand more than less. And so, okay, and the Jesuits have beautiful things to say about that in the liberal arts, like the magis. So, okay, let's say that's a Latin term for the more, invest in more. But it's very specific the way the Jesuits refer to it, that not only does life offer free will, and not only is that extremely important for children, for the future of the world, for the present, and free will is incredibly important. And what we do with those choices individually and collectively has great resonance. And as those choices are made in more holistic ways, it also has great radiance. And certainly we all are one step away from absolute evil. I mean, we don't want to act like we don't have that capacity, and it's always dangerous when we start acting like, no, we're good, or we don't need to work on this or that, whatever. But, which, happens a lot. If we just take American life right now, if we start saying, no, we don't need something as valid and powerful as Black Lives Matter or the Me Too movement, and it's close to ignorance or anti-intellectualism or anti-soulfulness, to say I don't really need your opinion or your deep belief that has a great chance of healing society, on any level. I guess we could say that. So psychology inside the liberal arts, psychology, its etymology is about psyche, and has some history with mythology, but it also is historically the soul, so it's the study of the soul, the study of the breath, the study of life, and that's probably why I was so attracted to it, and still am, and I think always will be. That's an amazing field to be within the liberal arts. I also love it that it houses both immense creativity and immense attention to science. Both qualitative and quantitative science, both interpretive and more positivist science, which would be more of a reductionistic science, very helpful reductionistic science, especially if we understand that that's one part of life, but it's very helpful to know, for example, that people with higher forgiveness capacity have significantly, in general, those groups of people with higher forgiveness capacity have significantly less anxiety, significantly less depression, and significantly less heart disease.
Wow.
And bridges are being made to stronger immune systems. So that's why the Mayo Clinic uses forgiveness therapy with everybody. So that wouldn't have happened without quantitative reductionistic science helping us understand that part. Now, it also, we wouldn't understand, well, how would you enact that or embody that when you're with people as they're dying or as they're emerging from trauma without qualitative science, where many researchers have sat down with individuals and said, tell me the story of your forgiveness and your healing from sexual abuse. Tell me the story of how you changed that in your own family generations. Tell me the story of what it meant to move away from solely the need to forgive and into the need to ask forgiveness and make things right. These are very nuanced elements of depth psychology. So, when I think of psychology, it does a great job overall with this holistic, the art of life and the science of life, and that's not a binary, that's a mutuality, and again, a polymorphous existence if we are open to hearing it and getting into it and listening to it. So yeah, that's probably the overall, and sort of brings me into my own life. Like, if I had to choose only one, thankfully I don't have to, but it would be working with individuals and families and couples.
Really? Okay.
Because it's like, I don't really feel like I think the writing is a beautiful thing. I think beauty is an expression of people and of God, really, and the soul of God. And so the center of that to me is the one-on-one, the face-to-face. Poetry is for me at least one step removed from that. Now, poetry together is maybe right in the middle of it all, face to face. But that's somewhat hard to. You can't really access that if we're just really in psychology. Often you're working on how do we heal from levels of trauma that normally are not capable of healing. So you're not really. You might bring in some poetry, but it's more like how to get from this level of devastation into an integrated wholeness, after so much fracture. So, and I see that as part of the center of life, and I think poetry expresses it or embodies it, but yeah.
So we've had time for probably one more question that I want to draw attention to the project, the Liberating Arts, and the impetus of the project, which was this CCCU grant that's called Between Pandemic and Protest. So what you were just talking about with trauma and forgiveness, yes, and all of that, I think really ties into this last question. But what do you think that the liberal arts can or should contribute to pandemic and protest of these two things that we have going on, the global health crisis,
yes,
and then these widespread protests regarding racism and injustice?
I think personally, I've had, under this scope of trying to go around different aspects, different parts of the world and listen, I think that's what would be very helpful in America, would be a deep listening to, what are best practices around the world. So when apartheid fell in South Africa, after so many years of injustice, trauma, genocide, how did it fall? When the communist regime that was highly oppressive in Czechoslovakia fell due to the Velvet Revolution, and the members of the charter, the artistic members of the charter, writers, Václav Havel, and they eventually democratically elect a playwright as a president. How did that happen? the deeply honored post-World War II German government under Adenauer. What kind of reparations did they do? You know, it's vast. It's stuff that we have not even considered. You know? They paid out reparations to every survivor of the Holocaust until the last survivor dies. You know? They funded Israel at 95% for the first 10 years. People don't know those things. You know? Yeah. But people that are sort of understand international politics, they do. You know? Elie Wiesel, the writer of Night and Dawn, comes to the Holocaust Museum in Berlin because they've asked him to speak. And he says, after all this, you haven't asked forgiveness of Israel. And so pretty much as soon as possible, the president of Germany goes to the Israeli parliament to ask forgiveness. You read that speech and your life's never going to be the same. Before the speech starts, half of, or a large number of the Israeli parliament walks out, as we would all imagine some of us would walk out too. Okay, the Lidice massacre outside Prague, too terrible to speak of, like many massacres, like the massacre of the Nez Perce on the Big Hole. You know, women and children burned, killed, mutilated. You know, what do people do? You know, like how do they make it right? And I think America is poised to listen to that from our own members. You know, if we listen, for example, to the ceremonies of reconciliation and of healing from the Cheyenne after the Sand Creek Massacre, from the Nez Perce in regard to the Big Hole Massacre, and we elected democratically leaders of non-dominant culture to design a forgiveness and reconciliation and reparations long-term sustainable stance, we would receive a lot of healing as a nation. And that's where the liberal arts, like, again, it's almost impossible to do those things if you're not deeply attached to the core of life, which is what the liberating and liberal arts do, you know. And so yeah, you know, we can point out Layli Long Soldier's book Whereas, which is doing that, you know. Her book of poems.
I love that book.
Incredible. And you know, but that's dominant culture, yet still in America doesn't want to listen to those voices in a way that would allow for those voices to lead us. You know, they're always gonna lead us subtly, but I'm saying lead the nation, like become the full voice of the nation. You know, and so I would say we need, as a culture, much greater humility. Now, we certainly, American culture has generated a lot of giftedness around the world. There's no doubt about that. And other countries would gladly, you know, rejoice with us about that, as we would rejoice with them about the gifts that they've created, you know. But certainly we would not be accused of being a humble, listening, feminine-oriented nation. Feminine arts, you know. Circular, nonlinear, not so focused on the rational. So that, we could say, is where we deeply need soulful learning and listening and changing. You know? So yeah, even if we just take the Nez Perce, okay, they do a ceremony every year at the site of the Big Hole Massacre, and you know, this is government troops back then, and you know, dominant culture will say, well, that was part of the Indian Wars, and you know, to the victor go the spoils, and you know, those that are conquered don't get to determine what happens next. Well, it's not quite that simple, is it? You know, inside all governments and all military actions, we have some very dignified, graceful human beings, and we have some that are despicable. We would never want to exalt the despicable as a nation, you know, but we kind of end up doing that when we act like, well, that's just, you know, people get conquered. People get conquered, you know, like, well, you know, we don't say the Nazis were worth exaltation, you know. Nobody says that, you know what I mean? Like, so unless you're wacko and need deep psychological help, you know. So in any case, we have a problem with that as a nation, just facing our shadow, you know, the shadow of slavery, the shadow of the Native American Holocaust, you know, the shadow of dominant culture dominating non-dominant cultures in America across the board, the shadow of patriarchy, the shadow of the school to prison pipeline. You know, those all require us as a country to be led by those who are in the know. You know? So it wasn't Germany that, in the Lidice massacre outside of Prague, it isn't Germany that determines how Lidice is going to heal. The leaders of Lidice post-World War II, they asked the countries of the world to help them rebuild Lidice, and the countries helped them rebuild Lidice that was destroyed by Hitler's vengeance. And they asked the countries of the world to donate roses for the Garden of Friendship and Peace. And they have their top, one of their top sculptors spends her whole life, Maria Yukatilova, building statues of the 82 children who were gassed to death. And these Majerus gas vans, which in Russian stood for soul killers. You know. And so you see the 82 children looking over Old Lidice, which is just a plain of grass and sort of mountains in the distance, which used to be the city, small village, you know. And New Lidice is over here. And you have the garden of hundreds of thousands of roses, you know, sent by 51 countries. And then Lidice in Czechoslovakia asked the children of Germany to plant those flowers with the children of Czechoslovakia. If we can get to that kind of thing as a nation, you know, the Nez Perce and the Shan, for example, and the Arapaho are leading us in those areas. The Nez Perce at their yearly celebration and ceremony around the sorrow and the new life is to ask the descendants of the U.S. military who did the massacring to come together with the descendants of those who were massacred. And then the Nez Perce invite them to walk through the dawn together holding lanterns in the dark as they come into the dawn. And then they gather in a peace and reconciliation circle. You know, so it exists, you know, we're just dominant culture just can't quite do it yet because dominant culture wants to dominate rather than be humble. Yeah. Unfortunately, dominant cultures always have to be humbled eventually. So it would be better if dominant culture can just humble itself with the help of our beloved, non-dominant cultures. So
I love those examples that you've given and articulated how the liberal arts helps us to remember those things and yes. helps us to have things to work towards, to guide us, to inspire us. As we would
forget it, right? Who can read night and not be forever changed? Who can read whereas and not be forever changed?
Yeah. Well, I've learned so much from this conversation, Shannon. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and to participate in the liberating arts. I encourage all of the listeners and viewers to check out Shannon's work at shannonray.com. And thank you again.
Rachel, you're such a great person. What a lovely night. Thank you. And thank you to everybody that's out there listening.